Hello and welcome to chapter 22. Today we're going to talk about applied metrics. So there's a lot of information in this chapter. I'm not going to talk a lot about that information here. I'm going to deal a little more with the history of the metric system and then just some of the keys out of the chapter. You will want to go through read the chapter to help you with the homework. But the first thing when we talk about metrics is we've got to talk about the history of it. Because if we don't understand the history, we don't understand the challenges we faced into getting to where we're at now. So believe it or not, the metric system dates back to like the 1700s in France. That's where metrics come from. Metrics is referred to as SI units, and SI equals System International. System International. So when you hear the term SI units, they're talking about metric. So the metric system is a French creation, okay? And it started in the 1700s in France. Throughout the 1700s, the French were developing and refining the metric system. England and America were still using our kind of antiquated old units, right? So America's history of the metric system actually started with Thomas Jefferson. He created a base 10 unit of currency. He came up with the dollar system. So a dollar, like $1 equals 100 pennies, right? That works really well. It's very easy to subdivide. And Thomas Jefferson was an early proponent of this measuring system that France was coming out with. His worry was that we wouldn't be able to get accurate details about it without sending an expensive delegation to France. So it kind of stalled there. He really didn't want to push it on the American people without having all the information. So the rest of the world was starting to latch onto this, and the political climate at the time really didn't help America. They had a big treaty set up in late 1700s, like 1795, 1798, somewhere in that region. That was a giant global conference where they get all these different countries together and discuss the metric system and figure out exactly how it was going to work and all that stuff. Well, guess what? They didn't invite us. And that's because they were really they being the French, were really upset with us because they had helped us out a tremendous amount during the Revolutionary War. And shortly thereafter, America, realizing that England was still need to play a very big role in our country, they signed the Jay's Treaty, which basically put us on good standing with English again. There were trade partners. We were going to be collaborators. It was going to be great. That really pissed the French off, and they were like, "Screw you guys! You're not invited to our cool metric meeting. You don't get to hear our cool stuff." So it started off really bad footing. So we being America, tried a couple times to go metric. And the last time was starting in the 1970s, something I remember vividly because I was born in 1975. You know, when I started school in the early 80s, it was told to all of us, oh yeah, in 10 years, everything was going to be metric. And guess what? It didn't happen. There's a lot of reasons for that. The biggest one is the expense that it was going to cost everybody to take all of our inch standard stuff, convert it to metric dimensioning. So it really never caught on. There was a lot of issues with people being upset with, like the labor unions hated it. Labor unions saw the implementation of the metric system as a way that big companies were going to ship jobs offshore, and they were right. So the labor unions had a huge pushback on it. 1984, Ronald Reagan was elected, and it was 1980. Ronald Reagan was elected, and he was much less a globalist than the former president, and he wanted to keep it all in house, and that's one of the other reasons that we're still doing metrics, or we're still doing the inch standard system. Now, there are some advantages to the inch standard system. The biggest one being fractions are really easy to work with if you know about fractions. So people think base 10 is really easy, and it is really easy in a lot of ways, right up until you start trying to half stuff. So if I've got 10 millimeters, okay? What's half of that? It's 5 millimeters. What's half of that? It's 2.5 millimeters. What's half of that? That's starting to get tricky. 1.25 millimeters. What's half of that? It starts to get even trickier. Fractions are easy. We've got a half an inch. What's half of that? Well, all I have to do is multiply the bottom one, right? Multiply the bottom one by 2, and I go down to 1/4. What's half of that? 1/8. What's half of that? 1/16. What's half of that? 1/32. What's half of that? 1/64. What's half of that? 1/28. So fractions work really well for doing this. And for those of us that are very, very comfortable with fractions, I prefer fractions. I really do. I don't dislike metric. I like metric as well, but I really like fractions for a lot of stuff. And in all honesty, people talk about when's the metric system going to hit America. It's already here. It's part of or running every industry in America except construction, of which welding is a part of. If you own a car built in the last 20 years, have you ever turned a wrench on it? Have you ever found a standard nut or bolt on an American car made in the last 20, 25 years? Nope, it's all metric. What do you buy your soda in? How many gallon is in a soda? It's not. It's all liters. It's everywhere, and it's how long is a race? I ran a 5K this weekend. That's kilometers. Metrics are here. The only place they're lacking is construction, and that's because there's the people that dating back hundreds of years, the people that built this country, the engineers that built the industrial infrastructure of the United States were the biggest pushback this whole time, and it's not going to change. Metric will still become incrementally more important to what we do as welders, but it's never going to change. We're always going to be running in standard dimensions. Okay. So, long story short, knowledge of both will help you, because the metric system will become more prevalent. You'll see more prints with mixed dimensions on them. You'll see more prints that don't have inch standard dimensions on them. And so if you're comfortable with the metric system and converting back and forth, you'll have a leg up on the other people. So nuts and bolts, let's talk about this. Nuts and bolts, I don't mean nuts and bolts, I mean stuff we need to know. So what are the base units? Base units of the metric system. For dimensioning, it's meters. This is M, which breaks down into centimeters. Shoot. cm, 2 millimeters. Those are the big ones we're gonna use. Weight is kilogram. Don't worry about that. So these are the ones we're gonna deal with. So works out real well. How many centimeters in a meter? 100. How many millimeters in a centimeter? 10. So it all works out, and that's the cool thing about metrics. So what we need to know is 1 inch equals 25.4 millimeters. Tattoo that on your arm. If you have that information, you can convert. Okay? That's what you need to know. 1 inch equals 25.4 millimeters. From there, I can go anywhere. It might take me a while, but I can go anywhere given that information. Okay? So let's talk about how we're going to express metric dimensions on drawings, or how we're going to express them in writing. So first off, if you're dealing with less than 1, you're always going to put a 0. You're always going to put a 0 if it's less than 1. Okay? There's no decimal or 0 for whole numbers. So if it's 2 millimeters, it's just 2 millimeters. I don't need to go, that's okay. I don't need 2.0 millimeters. No. If you can see that through the glare. Just 2 millimeters. Not 2.0, none of that stuff. Whole numbers, with decimal fractions need something following. So if it is 2.5, we need 2.50 millimeters. Okay. We don't ever put an S on millimeters to make it plural. It's just millimeters, just like that. And if you've got a drawing where everything is in millimeters, you don't need to write millimeters. It's assumed it's all millimeters. I don't need to write mm after everything. There is some other information about metric nuts and bolts threads in the book. The biggest one being metric threads are cut a little deeper, but the angles are all the same. But read that stuff. If you have any questions about metrics, come find me online. Come find me in the lab. I'll answer the best I can. Thanks.